Kia ora. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou. E no raurangatia mā nau mai haere mai whakatau mai ki tēnei hui mariko. Ko Barry Coatsahau, ko te kairahi o te patea whai whakaro. Nā reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Tihe Moriora. So a very warm welcome to you all. I'm Barry Coates. I'm founder and CEO of the charity Mindful Money. We do online seminars, and we actually started them during COVID, and we've continued. The seminars are generally held on Wednesdays at 12:15, and the videos and podcasts from the previous seminars are available on Mindful Money's website. We'll put the link in the chat. They're on YouTube and other good websites. Today, in our seminar, we're looking at the future of energy in New Zealand and globally. A fairly major topic for us. We're focusing on the electricity system, and we had planned this seminar, but it also turns out that it's a really good time to do it because of topical issues. So one of the things, BlackRock has just announced a renewable energy fund that they're saying will be capitalized initially at about $2 billion of investment. We've just had results announced by the four companies that control most of the retail and generation market, the four gentailers. They've just announced record profits. And the government's just launched its long-awaited energy strategy consultation. So great time to be talking about these issues. We've also got unresolved issues around Tiwai aluminium smelter. We've got issues around other things such as Lake Onslow battery storage, etc. So welcome to the seminar, and what we're going to do is we're going to start off with a video that sets the scene internationally, and I'm really pleased to welcome a video from Kingsmill Bond. We recorded this last night, and I hope you enjoyed. Kingsmill's the head of energy strategy at the Rocky Mountain Institute, RMI. And his video, I think, provides a really good context, particularly on the speed of change during our energy transition. So without further ado, I will give way to the video from Kingsmill Bond. And if you wouldn't mind playing that.
Hi, folks. My name is Kingsmill Bond. I work for the Rocky Mountain Institute, RMI. It's an energy think tank set up 40 years ago by Amory Lovins, who made the key point that efficiency gains would massively reduce the growth in energy and fossil fuel demand. There is now an additional driver to add to efficiency, which is the exponential growth of key renewable energy technologies, solar, wind, batteries, heat pumps, and so on. And we argue that the combination of efficiency with exponential growth will squeeze the fossil fuel industry into inevitable decline this decade, that we have reached peak fossil fuel demand in 2019. We're currently on a plateau, and we will be in clear decline by 2030. I have a background in finance, and I'm a strategist. So forget the culture wars, ESG, all that stuff. This is just a typical story of a technology revolution disrupting a massive incumbent who is trying to stop the change. Barry asked me to look at the decarbonisation of electricity today, which is one of the three aspects of the transition. And the story is simple to tell. We look at change so far, what continuity implies, and then what that means for investors in the fossil fuel system. So the story so far, pretty well known. Solar and wind costs have collapsed. These technologies are modular and small, or fairly small, and have got themselves onto learning curves whereby the costs of the technology drops by around 20% for every doubling in deployment. And they've fallen to around half the costs of comparable fossil fuel solutions. in around 80% of the world, with the rest is just following on. Sales, as a result, have taken off on indisputable S-curves, that is to say exponential growth curves. So we now sell 10 times as much solar as we did a decade ago, 100 times as much battery storage, 3 times as much wind. And again, change is far more advanced than people realize. 80% of capital expenditure on electricity generation is already on solar and wind. So we're very, very far advanced in the electricity transition, don't forget. Moreover, China is leading the deployment of this new energy technology, overtook the US in around 2015, the EU a couple of years later. And it matters that China is the primary driver of change, first of all, because it's a country where they can get things done. Secondly, it's, of course, the world's largest country. Unlike the Industrial Revolution led by relatively small UK, this is the world's largest country. And then thirdly, of course, it's important because it sparked a response from US and Europe, especially after Putin's illegal invasion of Ukraine. That's what has driven change elsewhere in the world. So Chinese leadership sparked change elsewhere too. Moreover, change is happening everywhere. Sorry, not everywhere, I should say, across the world, in lots of different places where you have a good government, decent government, which is able to seize the opportunity, from Brazil to Vietnam, from India to Morocco. We are seeing exponential deployment of this technology, because why wouldn't you? It's cheap, it's local, and it means you can avoid importing fossil fuels and reduce your pollution. So looking to the future, we think it's extremely likely that costs of these new energy technologies will continue to fall. We set out a range. We put in the numbers. We're assuming different learning rates, again around 20%, different growth rates, and we get a range whereby by 2030 the cost of solar is likely to be between around $20 and $30 per megawatt hour, and the cost of wind will fall to $30 to $35 per megawatt hour. So if I use Fatih Birol's framing, that is to say the cheapest electricity source in history will halve in price by the end of this decade. And worth dwelling upon this for a moment, because people not thinking through what it means for the very, very cheap energy source to halve in price. Moreover, the supporting technologies have gone exponential as well. I look here specifically at batteries. So storage, battery, and battery sales are growing also at a compound annual growth rate of, actually at the moment, over 60%. And the point again here is, without getting into the detail, batteries provide you with a solution to intermittency, which is the primary issue or concern that people have. Moreover, you're getting grid digitization capex growing at a compound annual growth rate around 15%. And then finally, efficiency gains are doubled famously in 2022 to 2%. And the Sunderburn Action Plan is seeking to grow that to 4% per annum. So you're getting the fossil fuel system squeezed from both sides, efficiency and the rapid deployment of these new energy technologies. Change is then moving out from a central core. The argument is sometimes made, change isn't happening in Russia, is not happening in the Middle East, therefore there is no transition. This chart is seeking to prove why that's a false framing of the problem. What happens is that change moves out from a central core in China and Europe and North America into the rest of the world, and you have leaders and laggards, but there is nevertheless an unstoppable tide of change. There are many barriers, but there are more solutions. So I kind of spend my life examining the different barriers to change that people talk about, intermittency and lack of minerals and lack of grids, whatever they are. But the point simply is that in spite of all the barriers, the growth has continued to happen. The reason why is that the solutions are bigger than the barriers. Just think about it for a moment. You have individual specific barriers in individual locations, but the solutions, like the sun and the wind, are absolutely global and everywhere, and anyone can deploy them at any time. So it's like the tide. There is inevitability to the success and the growth of these new energy technologies. And to be a little bit more specific, if you think about the barriers to change of intermittency, the leaders are already at 50% or higher and aspiring to 100% coming up with all the solutions. The world as a whole is at 14%, so the 14% penetration of solar and wind. So the barriers to change are far above our heads. The opportunity to change is very, very clear. So the future, we would suggest, is either exponential, and we're just playing with the numbers, but here's what exponential growth would look like at 15 to 20% growth of wind and 20-25% growth of solar. It gives you a situation where we'll be generating between 6,000 and 8,000 terawatt hours of solar a year by 2030, and 4,000 to 6,000 terawatt hours per annum of wind by 2030. So that's option A, shall we say, of just continued exponential, pretty simple. And then the alternative is that we have a classic S-curve where these technologies grow on the kind of S-curves that we've seen in lots of other technologies. And again, that will mean that they will be dominating generation by 2050, but also supplying all of the new generation by 2030. So your key framing then of the future is somewhere between an S-curve and an exponential, and we're kind of figuring out the maths of what it looks like. It's between, we think, 12 or 14,000 terawatt hours of solar and wind generation. So that's to say 4 to 6 times as much solar by 2030, 2 to 3 times as much wind. That's absolutely baked into the logic of continuity. And again, as an aside, the current fossil COP leader is calling for a 3-fold increase in solar and wind generation by 2030, as if that's a stretch. It's not a stretch at all. It's merely continuity. So what does that mean for fossil fuel demand, which is the kind of the final point? It means that fossil fuel demand has reached a peak. We think 2022 is the peak of fossil fuel demand. The absolute date kind of depends upon rainfall in China and nuclear in France, but it's kind of detail which isn't terribly important. But the point simply is that it's reached a peak at around 18,000 terawatt hours. It's going to plateau for a few years as this stuff moves up the exponential. But absolutely clearly, it will be in steep decline by 2030, and it'll be between call it 15 to 30% lower than it is today. So you have, therefore, by way of conclusion, a very, very clear bifurcation between absolutely inevitable rapid growth of renewable energy technologies with lots of problems to solve, lots of opportunities to make money by picking the winners in those sectors, versus the inevitable, inexorable decline of the fossil fuel system, which means that really from an investment perspective, the answer is pretty simple. You want to allocate out of the losing companies and sectors. You want to think about how to distinguish between companies which are greenwashing and lying to you versus companies who are actually doing something, and then finally get yourself involved in the companies which are building up these energy systems of the future. I'll stop there and hand back to Barry. Thank you.
We invited Kingsmill Bond onto the seminar because his research really is powerful, leading together with colleagues at Rocky Mountain Institute. They have, I think, provided a huge amount of evidence over the years on this coming energy revolution, and it's great to get this update from Kingsmill, and I encourage you all to go and look at his personal website and Rocky Mountain Institute to look at the reports that underlie this presentation. I'm reminded of the former Saudi foreign minister who said the Stone Age didn't end because they ran out of stones, and the oil age won't end because we ran out of oil. So this, I think, is a salutary reminder of that. So we're going to discuss this and many other issues related to the New Zealand renewable energy scene with our two panelists today. So I would like first to say a warm welcome to Deion Campbell. Welcome, Deion. It's great to have you here.
G'day, thanks for having me.
Deion, great. Deion is operating partner with the global investment manager HRL Morrison Co. He has extensive experience in energy infrastructure, project delivery, and executive leadership in order to secure and manage investments in energy and related infrastructure, working for Infratil and a variety of other clients. So Deion is also chair of Mint Renewables, a director of Manawa Energy, and was formerly CEO of Tilt Renewables before they essentially broke up and went into different forms of ownership. So Deion, could you start perhaps by telling us a little bit more about yourself and fill in some of those gaps from a very brief bio, and talk about your current and former roles?
Yeah, okay, fair enough. Look, I'm a Kiwi, started my career on the hydropower schemes in the Waikato River. So I've been in renewables my entire career, really. I count hydro as renewable, of course. But and one of the things I did when I joined Trustpower in 2001 was run New Zealand's first sort of large-scale wind farm at Tararua, and then went on to develop and build stages 2 and 3 of that wind farm. And then Trustpower launched its kind of renewables platform, got a few options around New Zealand, some in Australia, resulted in a few assets being built over there. Tilt Renewables got flipped out and I went over there and over time took the CEO gig, and then it got sold because we'd done such a good job at putting a platform together. So I guess I've watched the ebbs and flows of the renewables industry in New Zealand, especially because unlike other markets, we typically avoid subsidies for these types of assets. So we are lucky enough to get to do things the hard way or without money. I think there's an old comment about you have to think if you don't have money. So we do it differently to perhaps other countries. At the end of Tilt, I joined the Morrison Co team, who I've been with them by proxy through Trustpower for more than 20 years, but now I have direct involvement in their energy business, mainly focusing on this part of the world where I have spent most of my career. And now the chair of Manawa, actually, have been now for about 4 weeks, so that's good fun back home. It's the old Trustpower business. And so I've still got the Australia, New Zealand angle in the renewables industry through my role at EMCO, and also looking at broader decarbonisation matters through some other work I'm doing in Australia in kind of carbon farming, if you want. So yeah, that's where I spent my life.
And Deion, a lot of people may know the story of Tilt Renewables, but it's really significant in New Zealand renewable energy development. Can you give us just a snapshot of the growth of Tilt and how it came to be sold off?
Yeah, so back in about 2014, 2015, we at Trustpower had quite a large renewable development option portfolio in front of us in Australia and New Zealand, and we were finding that some of our shareholders weren't really able to contribute with equity to allow us to deploy those options. And so we found that the best solution to that was to split off or demerge that kind of solar and wind renewable book, including some operating assets, into a separate entity called Tilt Renewables, based in Melbourne. We popped over there because that's where most of the turbine suppliers were from, and some good access to people. And we were demerged in October 2016 and set up as a separate listed company, listed on both stock exchanges. Similar shareholders on day one, but that changed over time, as these things do. We went on to deploy some assets in Australia. Their large-scale green certificate scheme was supported finally by the government. So we had a target. We had some people looking to buy the energy and get the certificates from us. We built a couple of the immediate opportunities that required us to raise money. We then sold our largest asset operating in Australia, the Snowtown 2 wind farm, and that was a wind farm that sale really set the sector on fire. We built that wind farm for about $415 million about 5 years before we sold it, and we used it for 5 years, and then we sold it for $1 billion, right? And so that was a benchmark transaction in terms of not only for our shareholders, but also for the market in general about what these assets are really worth if they've got good offtake contracts. And so we gave all the money we raised back to the shareholders, which was pretty exciting. And then we went on to develop more, grow our pipeline. And in the end, Infratil, the largest shareholder, had so much inbound interest in how people could get a piece of Tilt that they decided to test the market properly. And that process led to us being sold. When I started as CEO, the company was valued at $800 million, and that was in 2018. And we sold in 2021 for 3 billion New Zealand dollars, just over 3 billion. So huge value growth for the shareholders that had stayed with us on that journey. Really good outcome, showed the value of the demerger back in the day. And it resulted in me being made redundant, which was also an interesting outcome. But that transaction also set the market on fire. Subsequently, the Australian energy market has seen multiple transactions of that sort of scale. And I think we sort of led the charge. I still think we were one of the higher quality pipelines of opportunities that are around. And here we are.
It's a fascinating story, and really sort of brings to life what Kingsmill was talking about in terms of some of the opportunities in renewable sector. Let's come back to that. I'll first introduce our other panelist, and a warm welcome to David Tong. Welcome, David.
Hi, Barry. Great to be here.
Great. Hey, David's campaign manager at Oil Change International. He was previously climate change program manager and in-house counsel at WWF New Zealand. He has been a representative at international climate change negotiations. He initiated the New Zealand Climate Action Network, NZCAN. He's deputy chair of Greenpeace Aotearoa New Zealand, and sits on the management committee of the Human Rights Foundation. He practiced law early in his career. And in terms of your career so far, David, that's an amazing number of things that you've done and initiated.
Thank you.
So we're very, very pleased to have you with us. To kick off, a similar question for you, David. Can you just kind of fill in the gaps for us around your current work on climate change with Oil Change International, and particularly your work on research and campaigning on the transition from fossil fuels?
So Oil Change International is a mixture of a campaigns organisation and a think tank. We describe ourselves as data-driven and people-powered, and work to unlock the transition to a renewable energy world by exposing the true costs of fossil fuels. My work leading our global industry team involves coordinating our company targeting work, and also as co-coordinator of the Climate Action Network's Global Energy Working Group, coordinating a lot of our diplomatic outreach in the UNFCCC spaces and beyond. In particular, one of our biggest areas of focus in my team over the last 5 years has been persuading the International Energy Agency, sort of the world's top energy modelers, as an OECD entity, to model a 1.5 aligned scenario. We did that because we saw that 5 years ago, big oil and gas companies were citing the IEA's old sustainable development scenario to justify new oil and gas expansion. When our research, going back to 2016 and the original report, The Sky's Limit, which has since been published in a peer-reviewed journal in an amended form, which we've updated every year since, and in fact, tomorrow we're publishing the 2023 update of that, has shown that burning just the oil and gas in operating fields now would take us beyond 1.5 degrees, even without coal. Burning the coal in operating mines now would take us beyond 2 degrees once you add that back in. So there's really no room for new fossil fuel finance. And we knew that if the IEA modelled a 1.5 aligned scenario, they would come to that conclusion. The good news is that they did. In 2021, they published their first edition of the Net Zero Emissions Report, NZE, which then became part of the World Energy Outlook in 2021 and 2022. And there'll be an updated scenario of that coming out in the next 2 months as well. That found that there was no room for new oil and gas beyond existing fields, and no room for new finance for oil, gas, and coal beyond existing fields and mines. So there's really no justification for funding fossil fuel expansion at this stage. Anything is outside the scope of what's possible with the Paris Agreement.
And David, just a quick follow-up to that. The theory was always, when the climate convention was signed, that the fossil fuel industry would make an orderly transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy, which would invariably need to happen. However, that hasn't happened, has it? And we've seen actually plans for further fossil fuel expansion and field development. Why do you think that is? Why do you think the fossil fuel majors haven't parlayed their huge capital and wealth and expertise into becoming major players in renewable energy?
There's the cliche that it's hard to get someone to believe something if their paycheck depends on them not believing it. And so much of the big IOCs, the big international oil and gas companies, share price comes from the massive volumes of untapped oil and gas reserves that they currently hold. If they take climate change seriously, then those reserves become stranded assets and their share prices collapse. There's also simply very little in the way of precedence for any business of scale making such a transition from one sector of the economy to another successfully in this way. The one example cited in oil and gas is Ørsted, formerly Dong, that transitioned from being a major oil and gas producer to a renewable energy producer. However, what's significant with that example is that Ørsted didn't close any fields. They just sold their fossil fuel assets to other companies who kept on producing. That doesn't help the climate. It just changes whose balance sheet the emissions are recorded on. So there's really little reason to think that big oil and gas companies, they haven't so far. Our analysis shows that no company comes even close to aligning with a minimum of 1.5. Carbon Tracker, Reclaimed Finance, and others have reached similar conclusions. There's no reason to think these businesses are serious in doing so, and there's every reason to think that they are doing their best to fear predatory delay and doing their best to lead us to a disorderly transition. Internal documents from ExxonMobil and many of the other big companies shows that a deliberate strategy of denial and delay from as early as 1970.
Yeah. So thanks for that, David, and we'll come back to some of those issues. I'll ask my colleague to put in the chat the report that Mindful Money just prepared, drawing on Oil Change International Research and other organisations, Carbon Tracker Initiative and others, to show that not only these major oil and gas companies increasing their production, but also that there's a lot of New Zealand investment, rising amounts of New Zealand investment flowing into those companies. And as David said, with the extreme financial risks of stranded assets. So again, we'll come back to that. I want to bring you back in again, Deion, and to come back to the New Zealand renewable energy scene. The implications of Kingsmill's presentation a little bit different in New Zealand renewables, partly because our starting point isn't a far lower percentage of renewables, but we're starting from current level of about 85%. But we do need rapid growth in order to meet projected demand and also drive towards 100%. what are you seeing from your perspective now as being the attractiveness of the renewable energy centre, particularly, it sounds attractive because BlackRock's just saying that they're going to leverage a big fund in it. So how does the sector look to you and the opportunities ahead?
Yeah, look, the sector has always been attractive to us, and that's why Infratil has maintained its holding of Trustpower for more than 20 years, and supported all the growth we've done. And they're back now, and we're assembling a nice portfolio of options to develop and deploy as the market requires. And as New Zealand's largest independent power producer, we are largely renewable. We do have a legacy sort of 5 megawatt peaker up north, but that doesn't really run much. What I think the problem with Kingsmill's kind of averaging and all that is there are some nuances in terms of context for New Zealand, and one is we're a long way away and we're a small market, so attracting kind of the best price and the best technology and availability and all that stuff is still quite difficult for us. And that's where Morrison Co has perhaps some advantage in that they have a global platform in renewables and different vehicles. And so we kind of are seen as one buyer by some of the suppliers. So we kind of like that and hopefully can leverage off that into New Zealand. But it's more, I take the Australian example, that their politicians spent the early 2000s, maybe to 2015, sort of trying to avoid this problem and trying to stop any kind of progress on the transition for them. And what they found is that that interference has now put them really behind the game. And I worry that is where we're going to head in New Zealand with some of the concepts, I think, well-meaning kind of investigatory processes that the government's going through just makes us all go, oh, let's just wait and see how this rolls before we invest. And anyone investing in either technology, any technology needs a bit of certainty. And when the government has a mind to play around, it stops that certainty. So we need to settle everything down, and Onslow in or out, I guess I don't need to have an opinion there. They need to stop it so we can get on and do what we need. For example, Genesis, they are very aware that Huntly has to go over time, particularly the coal burning part of Huntly, and they're out there trying to make it happen in their own way. They did that by signing up a long-term offtake with Tilt Renewables' Waipipi wind farm back in the day, and so they're there trying to encourage the sector. And I think what I would see is the government's role probably is just to be a happy owner of their share of 3 of the large generator retailers in New Zealand, and try and put some frameworks around supporting that in the regulatory space. Things like the National Built Environment Act, I think it's well-meaning, but it has the impact of making it harder to actually get a resource consent for anything in New Zealand, not easier. And the original form of it was making it harder for our initial or existing hydro base to actually be there in the long term, particularly the smaller hydros. And it seems mad that that's the approach that a government takes because of some other ideology, when we've got this mission to decarbonise our energy sector. And the last thing I'll say is on the 100% renewables point, I think that last couple of percentage in the electricity market is harder to achieve than other parts of the energy sector that could be decarbonised first. And I would like to see some focus shift to how can renewable energy encourage other industrial processes to decarbonise, perhaps with some support of something like gas for a while, so that we can get everyone there and then go for 100% renewable electricity. I think the other way around will make it pretty difficult for people to see a way through.
Yeah, if the independent generators are investing in New Zealand, they're obviously facing incumbents with a dominant position in the energy market. Does that create difficulties, for example, in getting long-term offtake agreements if the gentailers are essentially controlling much of the retail market as well as the generation market? Does that put off some potential independent generators?
Well, I think it doesn't really. They can put them off for sure. I think the main reason we're not seeing that many independent players over here is that the market's quite small. So you might as well go to Australia or somewhere else and do it. But what we are seeing, and we did at Tilt, we were the first independent generator of scale in New Zealand with Tilt. People are interested if you've got the right project. And what going back to the Kingsmill work is that solar, relatively cheap, people say, but it's actually relatively low value as well. So you need to be able to time shift solar energy to create value out of it for, say, a retail client base. So those people with storage, and it's largely our large hydro power stations, are the ones that will take that value. So they want to offer you less than you think you'll get for your solar farm output, right? Or even your wind farm. So someone's got to get the benefit of that firming. And that's what I think the IPPs are struggling to understand, is they won't get the spot price of whatever it is today, $150 or whatever it is. That's not the value of what the energy is they're creating. And that's where the market needs to be better informed, I think.
Yeah. Good. And David, when we did our work in investment, as I said, New Zealand investors have been piling into fossil fuels. Are you seeing internationally a kind of growing hesitancy of investors to make that investment? Are they obviously, with a higher oil price, it appears that a lot of investors are looking for short-term returns. But are you seeing them also kind of increasingly aware of the risks of what Kingsmill talked about with a inevitable decline in fossil fuel demand?
There are some examples of investors acting on the basis of stranded assets risk, but relatively few. What is clear is that private investment in fossil fuel production, capital going into that has declined considerably since the Paris Agreement. However, we're seeing a surge in new investment and new production in this post-pandemic moment, or post-first wave of the pandemic moment, as we have these record oil prices. There's a risk of a surge in new production coming online between this year and 2025 in the tune of gigatons, like 17% of our remaining carbon budget for 1.5, on top of an already exhausted carbon budget. It's the scale of it. Interestingly, bank finance for oil and gas production has declined from 2021 to 2022, but that is not due to the bank's policies, as far as we can tell. It is due to these record profits. When companies have massive cash windfalls in their profits and are paying off loans early, not taking out new loans, and doing massive share buybacks, they're not seeking to borrow from banks to finance new projects, to finance capex in the way that they were earlier. So that's not showing like a systematic change from the banking sector, but the sort of unique features of the 2021-2022 windfall profits moment, and particularly triggered by Russia's invasion of Ukraine after the collapse in price from the pandemic.
Yeah. So that picture is a kind of rapid transition globally, and the potential for that to happen in New Zealand. Deion, when we talked to Kingsmill in the making of the video, he did pass a comment about the New Zealand market, that actually issues of intermittency have perhaps been overblown as barriers, that the potentially intermittent supply from renewable and wind and hydro could easily be dealt with by overbuilding renewable energy and using hydro as more of a base. Is that something that rings true for you? Do you see this kind of push for renewables leading to a lot of investment coming in? Of course, assuming that the policy stability that you were looking for is going to be delivered by a future government.
Yeah, I think the Boston Consulting Group report sort of suggested about $42 billion is needed in New Zealand, right? So there's definitely money to be invested in the sector. I think the intermittency is real, and I think if you look at some of the volatility in the energy market at the moment in New Zealand, it's because of that. And that is, dry year. We're still hydro dominated, so dry or overly wet kind of years do the same thing in terms of our ability to peak and firm renewables. The concept of overbuilding something like wind, well, yes, you can do it, of course, but then you pretty much are spilling that energy. Therefore, this cost per kilowatt hour that Kingsmill sort of graphed nicely for us goes out the door because you're not making as many kilowatt hours as you might have from your wind farm. And so it's really, really important that somehow the coordination of energy availability in real time is set somehow so that the cheapest energy, which is wind, say, or solar, whatever, is used in favour of something like hydro, which you can hold back for the next minute when there's not so much wind. And I think that's where perhaps the government plays a role, is that forecasting and that real-time control. And that will lead to also demand-side opportunities to say, hey, this is happening, go and do what you do now because the sun's out or there's a cloud come over. That sort of control is where we're here. And I've said for a few years now that the company that controls the control system will probably be most powerful in the energy market going forward, right? Because you can mash all these appliances and systems and generators together and get the best efficient outcome. There will be a bit of overbuild. There probably will be a generally kind of higher lake level than New Zealand's seen, and that might help with the dry year risk, but we've still got limited storage in New Zealand, so there will have to be some batteries. There probably is a role for some biofuel of some sort. But what I would hate to see us do, and this is personal opinion, is put all our eggs in one basket in something like Onslow, where we've just seen resilience is important through the cyclones, etc. And Australia's trying to move away from all of its eggs in one coal basket, if you like, big locations, employment issues, all that, and make their electricity system more diverse, more distributed like we have now. And we're saying, let's do the opposite. Let's put it all in one thing in the South Island where it's really not the right location electrically, right? And so why don't we carry on building on our diversity that we've already got and make it scale, would be my preference than something like Onslow.
So we could be talking for a long time about these issues, and we're running out of time. Just a final one to you, Deion, for passing back to David. Deion, obviously these investments in Tilt and Lodestone and other renewables companies are primarily private equity investments. Are there likely to be opportunities for many of the audience who are retail investors in future, or is that not on the cards?
Yeah, well, I mean, Tilt was publicly listed, so that was a good opportunity for people, and perhaps before people really got wind of what was going on in the sector, maybe. But the big listed gentailers are still active. Mercury is just completing its build at Turitea, and Meridian's going for gold over in the Hawke's Bay. So I think there's a lot of work to be done by those companies, Genesis and Contact as well. But there will be private players. That's hopefully the way it is. BlackRock's a good example. We're not really short of money, but more money coming in is always helpful. So I think people will find the opportunities to invest in the ones that are listed. I'm not sure how else, unless they want to go in the private market, but that's a bit difficult for some people.
Yeah. And David, for you, the kind of prognosis of this transition being a bit messy, as the Kingsmill's scenario shows, we're close to peak oil, and in the past, when fossil fuel markets have declined, such as during COVID, it had a dramatic effect on lowering price. Do you see kind of pretty severe price disruptions and investment disruptions coming up in future?
Yes, if we have an unmanaged transition. What we're seeing, like what happened in the COVID crisis, was the opposite of a managed decline in oil and gas production. It was a sudden shock. we need in climate policy to be cutting with both sides of the scissors together. We need policies designed to destroy the demand for fossil fuels. And yeah, I fully agree. The goal isn't to get to 100% renewable electricity as fast as possible. The goal is to get as close as possible to 100% renewable energy use as fast as possible. Decarbonize the whole economy, not just the electricity sector. In doing that, we need to destroy the demand, but also to act to regulate the production. If production surges and demand falls, then we'll have investors left holding stranded assets. If we don't manage that production, we will have dumping of oil and gas infrastructure on the global south. We will have wells being abandoned in New Zealand even, with the costs of cleanup being dumped on the taxpayer. So we need to be cutting both the demand and the production together. That's where things like the offshore oil ban are crucial. New Zealand's participation in the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance is really important, and we can send very strong political signals in this transition to the most renewable possible economy.
Yeah, great. That's a good perspective to end on, that it does need to be a managed process. And I think that the last thing that central bankers need internationally is a crisis from the energy sector, and it would hurt and the environment and a lot of people along the way. So thank you both very much. I'm sorry we didn't have much more time, because actually we're just starting to get into these issues. We're going to have a follow-on seminar in our next series. We can delve into a little bit more of these issues, particularly since the government's just launched their energy strategy consultation, due for a response in November. So some of you in the audience might want to gear up and put your responses to that into the government, and we will have a chance to go a bit deeper into some of these issues in future. In the meantime, thank you both very much. Those were both really great perspectives, and I think dovetailing very nicely with Kingsmill's video. So thank you very much, Deion, for coming on to the seminar. Thank you very much, David. About time we had you on the seminar, so we're thrilled to do so. And thank you all very much. So for the audience, please stay in touch, and we've got next week coming up an interesting discussion on financial advice. So the two financial advisors that were award winners from the Mindful Money Awards this year, Ethical Investing New Zealand and MoneyWorks. So we're having Peter Lee from Ethical Investing NZ and Kerry Church from MoneyWorks on our discussion next week. We're really looking forward to it. They're not only going to talk about their views and their own practices, they're going to talk about the ethical financial advice challenge more broadly. So please join us next week for that discussion. I wanted to say that this series that we're in would not be possible without generous sponsorship from Alphinity, Medical Assurance Society, Mercer, and New Zealand Green Investment Finance. Thanks also to sponsorship from Chapman Tripp, Booster Asset Management, Harbour Asset Management and Trustees Executors, and we've had contributions also from Pathfinder and PyFunds. So please join us next week for our penultimate seminar in this series, and thank you very much for joining us today. Stay active, invest mindfully. Ngā mihi nui ki koutou, mā te wā.